Big day today. We're going to talk about supply and demand. It's probably our most important chapter of the book. We're going to start off with demand and explain what that is, what we mean by that, and what we can expect to happen around demand, and the consequences of changes around demand. But before we do, we need to define one term which is generally synonymous with the term we hear so often, supply and demand, and that term is the market. The market is any place where buyers and sellers come together and agree on two things: price and quantity. So when I say the word market, some of you are probably thinking about like a farmer's market. Some may be thinking about a grocery store. Based on that definition I just provided, you might be thinking about like eBay because of the bidding that goes on a site like eBay. All of those things are true. You might have thought, as I said that, well, the grocery store, you don't haggle, you don't agree on price and quantity. But in the iterative process of consumers coming into the store and buying or not buying goods, actually that bidding is going on. So all of those fit in our model of market, and anything else beyond that where buyers and sellers are coming together to trade. They are setting goods, they're deciding quantities, how much to buy or sell, and price. And I deliberately use the word trade because I want to make something clear. We need not necessarily be referring to prices, certainly in US dollars, or really, truly, even necessarily in money. We could apply our framework, if we had to barter or something like that. So if there's a trade to be had where things will have a cost to the consumer and the manufacture or provision of those things had costs to the seller, they're coming together and they're agreeing on how much to transact for some trade, we have a market. It's not just about the money. So hopefully that's clear. As I said, we're going to start with demand. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define the term demand. I would write this down. Demand is the measure of the quantity that would be purchased at various prices, all else held constant. And there's a distinction here between the term I just defined, demand, and the term quantity demanded. The quantity demanded is the number of the units that would be bought and sold at a price. And that's going to matter. I'm not too picky about semantics, how words are said, specific things, but there's an important difference between demand and the quantity demanded that's going to come back our way when we practice these things. So again, the definition of demand is the measure of the quantity that would be purchased at various prices, all else held constant. That's something different from quantity demanded. Okay, now our next term we want to make sure we're comfortable with is the law of demand. Now in economics, there's an old joke, like if you ask 100 economists to predict something, how many answers will you get? I'm sure you're dying to know. You would get 200 answers. Because when you ask an economist something, each one will say, well, on the one hand you have this, and on the other hand you have that. So 2 hands times 100 economists is 200 answers. I don't have many jokes, outright jokes, so I hope you're laughing. You won't get many chances. The law of demand, law is a strong term. It implies it's just always so. Yet, I have the 100-200 thing. Well, our law of demand, has been historically found, at least in data, An exception to that law, um, that's called a Giffen good. Miller devotes a lot of attention and time to a Giffen good. So, in what I'm saying is that in economics, there are very few laws, and even those aren't rock solid. But this is a pretty good one. This is pretty good. And I know it's pretty good because if you talk at your computer, I know what you're going to say when I suggest you fill in the blanks here. The law of demand goes something like this. As the price of a good increases, all else held constant, as the price of a good increases, consumers will purchase blank of the good. All else held constant, as the price of a good increases, consumers will purchase less of the good. That's the law of demand. It's a pretty good law because I think you just know it in your gut. Like, oh yeah, of course, you charge me more for something, I'm going to buy less of it, or people are going to buy less of it. I say goods there. It could be goods or services. Just trying to be succinct. Another way to look at that is the more people have to sacrifice for a good, the less of that good they'll seek. Again, we need not necessarily be talking in dollars or even in currencies. Think about that. The more people have to sacrifice for a good, the less of that good they'll seek. I like to broaden this up beyond just the business world. It makes it, I think, more interesting, and it is so. So my example good that I like to refer to through supply and demand is one that is really, really close to obsolete, and I know it is. I'm not that old and naive. I know the good I'm talking about in my notes is something going away from our lives. But there's a reason I'm sticking with it, and it's not just because I don't want to change my notes. Changing my notes isn't that big of a deal. They're Word documents. No, I'll explain my reasoning when we get to it. But my go-to good, since I'm home, I have a few of them here, are compact. I'm talking about compact discs, CDs. Like this one right here, the Steve Miller Band Greatest Hits. It's upside down in my CD case. This was a CD case. People used to keep this in their cars because cars had a slot in the dash where you put these things in your stereo, had a slot there, and there are songs imprinted in this thing, and they'll play in your car or even at your home. They had CD players. But you had to buy these things to have the music. When I'm saying CDs, I'm not referring to this Chemical Brothers recorded right here. That's just some of my gym music, or Stone Temple Pilots up there, or the Terps Fight Song up there recorded. I'm referring to the Steve Miller Band pre-recorded, something that you buy at Walmart or what they used to have around called music stores, or I'm referring to like Tone Loc down here. Yeah, that I bought at some store a long time ago, clearly, right? These are CDs, compact discs, and when we get to supply, I think you'll understand why I'm using them as my go-to example. And now, hopefully with that clear, in the past, I've said CDs, and people only envision the recorded CDs, like the Chemical Brothers thing I have up here, where it's like CDR or a CDRW, and you get those at like Staples or Office Depot or whatever. And if you're thinking of those when I say CDs, you're not going to understand my examples at all because that's total. It's a very different product. I'm referring to music CDs. Okay, now to illustrate the law of demand, you should have something to write with somewhere in your life there, and maybe a sheet of paper. Somewhere on the corner of a sheet of paper, answer this question. How many CDs, compact discs, in 2020 are you likely to purchase? Think about that for just a second. Write down a number. I know for most people watching this, it's a big fat goose egg. 0. I'm not going to buy any CDs in 2020, you're thinking. And I'm not disagreeing with you. You probably really know yourself, and you're probably really not going to. But if we're establishing a market, the law of demand here, let's explore the price effect on that number. You see, I buy still Those I haven't listened to in a long time, but I still typically buy one or two CDs a year because I actually like to have a hard copy of my music. I'm about to cancel. I've already actually canceled my Amazon Prime, so I'm about to lose my old playlist that I've established there. Um, whereas my CD collection, that's just I have a large CD collection. I'll talk more about that, but I still have that, and I'll always have that. They don't seem to go bad. And I like that. I like to know that I'm not beholden to paying a monthly subscription to have what I've paid for. I like to have it. And there are a few other people I've talked to who are like me because among the people watching this, most of you listed zero, but some people listed like one, two. I've had students list like 10 or 12. My little girl, who's 10, ordered two CDs. They were used, but she ordered two CDs through my eBay account about 2 weeks ago. One of them has arrived in the mail, and the other one's en route. So there's still people who are consuming CDs out there. Okay, so if we add together how many we were willing to purchase, we have our summative demand, or we have the quantity demanded at a price, which I haven't explored yet, because if I had gotten into the weeds with that, it would have confused things. See, when I'm saying how many CDs will you purchase, I'm taking it for granted that CDs are somewhere between, let's say, $10 and $20. Okay, you might envision used CDs or new CDs. I didn't specify again because I didn't want to cloud the issue. But most people, I've done this a number of times face to face, and most people kind of nod along. Yeah, $10 to $20. That's a pretty broad range, anyhow. And yeah, that's about what I was thinking. Okay, so most of you already said zero. Some of you probably have a one or two or maybe a five written down on a sheet of paper somewhere. Add those together. Of the people watching this, all together, we're going to have about, I think, 80 or 90 people should be watching this video this semester. Presumably, it'll never be seen again after this semester. Who knows? Of 80 or 90 people, all 80 or 90 of you probably recognize that we have some positive number of CDs that would be purchased at the $10 to $20 price range, right? I mean, some of us buy two, some of us buy three. That makes five. Some of us buy five. That makes 10. So the horizontal summation across these amounts that we would purchase is how many that is our quantity demanded at this price of, let's say, roughly $15, midway between 10 and 20. Now let me hit you with a hypothetical. What if I said, no, the price isn't roughly $15. The price is now $40. What just happened to that number of how many CDs we would purchase? Whatever it is, does anybody think the number went up? What, $40, people would buy more? There's unique cases for some goods that might be like that, but let's face it, for our CDs, these things that are near obsolescence anyway, we all know that quantity demanded is going to come down at a higher price than it was at that lower price where we started. So the law of demand, it has its violators, perhaps, but it's pretty good. As the price of a good or service increases, consumers will purchase less of that good or service, all else held constant. That's our law of demand. Now, our next step is to illustrate that law with a graph. I bet everybody who's heard this is feeling very comfortable about that. They're probably saying, man, you're beating this to death. Good grief. Everybody knows that. Why are you talking about it so much? Because it gets complicated, and we really have to fully get this to keep moving forward and building on it, because it gets more complex. So now we're going to illustrate using our supply and demand framework, or our illustration of the market eventually, what we just said, the law of demand. So I've set up my axes here, but I have not yet labeled them, because labeling the axes is part of our challenge, and keeping it straight isn't always so easy. I know, because I've graded a lot of papers and they get switched quite often, where people put X and Y here, and X and Y aren't the variables of interest. What we're looking for, again, is where buyers and sellers come together and agree on two outcomes: price and quantity. So that's what we're looking for. Now, when we label our axes, we put price up here. We always put price up here, and we put quantity down here. And that is a little counterintuitive, because in algebra, we're used to seeing this as the control variable and this as the dependent variable, or the independent variable and the dependent variable. Well, I just define the law of demand using price as the thing that the consumers are responding to, which would mean it would be in control, okay? Or quantity was the thing that was dependent, yet I have it down here. For now, till you take micro, you just have to memorize that this is how it is. When we get into micro, into specific production, the cost of production, we can explore why this does make sense even in an algebraic way. But we're just not there yet. We don't need to be. So for now, memorize this. Price goes up there, quantity goes down here. And in a little memory aid that sometimes I see students when I'm face to face with them go, oh, that kind of maybe will help you memorize this a little bit, is that if you have it set up correctly, you have a very visible, convenient set of parallel lines. See, price, the stem of that P, is running parallel to the vertical axis. If I put the P down here, yes, it's still parallel, but you wouldn't see it. They're very far apart. So maybe that helps. Just burn it into your memory. Price is always up there. Therefore, quantity is down here, because those are the things that we're looking for outcomes in, price and quantity. Now, I try to minimize my complexity with these numbers, okay? When you ask people about econ, typically, if people don't like econ, it's because they don't like the math. So I try to step away from the math as much as I can and still make it make sense. So here's about as complex as I like to go into things, at least for now. These are number lines, and right here is the beginning of both number lines. So this is where this number line is 0 for quantity, and this number line is 0 for price. Okay, if I go far from 0, and I'm talking about quantities, how could I describe numbers way away from 0 if it's a quantity of something? I would describe that as, I mean, you or I, if we were talking about it, we would say if it's a number really far from 0, which on our relative scale here is really far from 0, I would say out here we have a lot of whatever it is. Whatever it is, numbers really far from 0 are a lot. And numbers really close to 0, we would call it, if we're speaking grammatically correctly, we would say a few. Or we might not speak grammatically correctly, and we'd say a little. You know, if it's a count, it's a few. If it's a volume, it's a little. So down here, I would say we only have a few. The numbers in this range. So our quantities can be right at 0. Or we might only have a few, or we might have a lot. Whatever these numbers are, we don't need numbers there, because ones close to 0 are a lot smaller than numbers far from 0, every time, 100%. We can do the same thing over here, except we probably wouldn't call prices a lot and a few. You know, talk about a few dollars. Well, not usually. We could say a lot of dollars, but that actually sounds weird. No, normally we say prices that are really far from 0, we typically call those expensive. And numbers that are not too far from 0, usually when I'm speaking to people, we call these things cheap. So I'm going to put points, or not points, but some scale here. But we're talking about a range, but I'm just putting a scale here to get sort of like we had numbers here. But I don't think we need them. This is about as complex as we really truly need to understand supply and demand, the meaning of the framework and how things are expected to work. We'll do plenty of numerical examples with homework and stuff like that, but let's see if we can make it make sense using something that isn't as intimidating as numbers are for people sometimes. Going back to our law of demand, what we said was, as the price of a good increases, consumers will purchase less of that good. So let's suppose that at first we were referring to a cheap price. Relatively speaking, would people buy a lot or a few at cheap prices? At cheap prices, most of us, or the sum of all of us, would be willing to buy a lot. If you jack up the price of the good, all else held constant, most of us would reduce our consumption of the good, or willingness or ability to purchase it. At an expensive price, we would only buy a few. connect those very general dots. And now what you've done is illustrated the law of demand with what's called a demand curve. That's how we can get there. Now, all of this is all else held constant. Nothing else is changing in the world. We're only focused on the price effect on quantity. At cheap prices, the quantity demanded is a lot. That's a single point. At expensive prices, the quantity demanded is only a few. That's also a single point that I have here, right? The next step is to explore, well, what about the other things that aren't price? Those things change demand. These are quantity demanded. Changes in demand are movements of the entire curve. And I'm going to make that just a little bit of a cliffhanger. You're going to have to stay tuned to see the sequel, part 2, to explore these things.